Hello, everybody. Welcome to the BasuandGodin Notebook on this Friday, February 28th. I'm Marc-Antoine Godin and Arpin. Big news today. Obviously, we were thinking of there are all little different topics that would have been interesting today, but it will all get covered and shadowed by the news of Kirby Dach missing the rest of the season. He has been operated to his right knee, the same knee, right? That he had surgically repaired last season. So he's out for the remainder of the year, and the Montreal Canadiens are saying that he's going to be ready to play next season. But this is devastating for the Canadiens, but especially for the player.
Yeah, I think more so for the player than for the Canadians. I think in a sense, I mean, Dach had an opportunity here over these last 20 odd games, last quarter of the season to I guess prove himself and to reassure the Canadians that he was a solution for them long term at the center position. I think even if he'd gone on some sort of tear over the last quarter of the season, enough doubt would have already crept in to the Canadiens' long-term planning that would have led them to explore the market this offseason for a centerman who can fill that 2C hole. And now, without that opportunity, that doesn't really change. They're still going to explore the market to try and add a centerman this offseason, via trade, whether it's via free agency. This was probably already a priority for the Canadiens, and this just, erased any doubt of that being a priority. So, it's unfortunate for Dach. It's a season for him that just never really got going. He was never able to pick up where he left off 2 years ago. The Canadiens were very deliberate in their messaging that it's going to take him time. It's tough to get back after a full season lost. They really tried to remove the pressure from Kirby Dach to perform, but at some point that switch flips and you start to realize that enough time has passed here and this might just be who we have as a player. So I think that's where the Canadiens were at. And it's very unfortunate for Kirby Dach, for sure. It changes his outlook on himself, most definitely. But as far as the Canadiens' outlook and their planning, I don't know if it changes all that much.
Well, it's unfortunate for the player because right now he's going to be seen as damaged goods, and there's a clear vulnerability to his knee from this point on, and I don't know how it's going to impact the trajectory of his career from now on. It's is he going to be is he going to be playing with this cloud over his head for the rest of his career, wondering when is my knee is going to give up the next time? It's problematic because knee injuries like that they can ruin careers, and I sure don't hope that for him. But you're right when you say that it seems as though that even though a lot of people say, well, it takes a year for the sort of surgery that he had before you can find a player being back in full form, but he was not convinced, but he was saying himself that at some point he didn't feel like the injury was a factor anymore, that everything was okay. There was no more hesitation in his skating, and it didn't factor into his play. So, but now it's like being back to square one. And I'm not sure that I was fully on board with the Montreal Canadiens going after this guy, making the trade that they made, and it would be revisionist history to look at, you know, how Frank Nazar is blossoming in Chicago, or thinking that the Canadiens, oh gosh, they would be so much better with Alexander Romanov on their defense. Fact of the matter is, I thought it was a good gamble when they acquired Dach. He showed glimpses of what he was able to do, but now that priority of going after a second line center is not only reinforced, but it's also that the fact that Dach is injured again, that would also cast some doubts for other teams. Because if the Canadiens were thinking, we might upgrade that center position, and it might involve us dangling Dach as part of a package to improve at that position. Well, that asset is less attractive now than he was.
Yeah.
Other teams will be hesitant to take a gamble on this guy.
Yes, but in reality, how much trade value did Kirby Dach really have with the season he was having? I mean, there would already be hesitancy. Like, I think the Canadiens would be selling low on a player if they were to trade Dach, even without the injury.
Mm-hmm.
The injury obviously makes it worse. I'm not arguing that, but even if they tried to move Dach this offseason, they would be selling low because he's having an objectively bad season. It's not. Listen, he's played one fewer game than he played 2 years ago, and he has 16 fewer points. I mean, it's
second worst differential in the league.
Yes, I mean, it is what it is. It's not as if teams would be beating down the Canadiens' door to try and get their hands on this guy, even if he didn't re-injure the same knee. But for sure, that injury definitely impacts their ability to move him. And frankly, I don't even think they should move him, because they would have. And even if he hadn't gotten injured, I don't think they should have moved him, because just because he's not a solution to the 2C problem doesn't mean he's not a useful player for the Canadiens. Now, he has another year under contract, and then he's an RFA with arb rights. So he's under team control for a while. It's not inconceivable to me that the Canadiens in their future could use a 6'4", 220-pound right shot winger, let's say, somewhere in their top 9, and that he doesn't make them better. It's still entirely possible that that's the case, and they have runway left to figure that out. That's always been the beauty of the contract they signed with him, which was, an extended bridge with, because there was already doubt and risk involved with his profile when the Canadiens acquired him. They have another year to see what this player is about. They have another 2 years, as a matter of fact, to see what this player is about and whether he fits into the plan or not. And after next season, if he doesn't show any progress or doesn't show an ability to mesh with anyone in a defined role, then the Canadiens can move on from him. But yeah, it's you're right that his trade value is diminished. I just don't think it was all that high to begin with, based on the season he just had. And the most important thing that I think that you mentioned is him just starting at square one with his knee, and all the doubt that he had to get past in terms of his ability to physically go out there and play and battle and be physical, which is what I think was the big difference between Dach this season and Dach 2 years ago. Is, if you remember, Dach turned it around 2 years ago. He finished with 15 points in his final 19 games that year. And I believe it was a concussion that kind of ended his season. But is that right? I think it was, yeah.
Yeah.
And
not sure if it was ever labeled a concussion, but
no, but it was our belief, yeah. He like, the nastiness in his game went up a notch, and it really, I remember him starting a fight off a face-off with might have been Andrew Kopp. Anyhow, someone on Detroit, but I don't remember. But still, he was hitting people. He just got really similar to what we saw from Juraj Slavkovsky in Ottawa the other night, and we've seen a little bit since then. Dach started to realize that he's a big boy and he can do some damage out there if he plays with a bit of a mean streak. And that mean streak, we never really saw it this season. And I think whether he wants to admit it or not is probably partly due to the fact that he had questions about that knee. And, we never even saw the player. Like, I think we forget that coming out of training camp last season, Dach objectively looked like the team's best forward. He was playing with Juraj Slavkovsky all through camp. The two of them looked like they would be a terror together. Two big boys going around, hitting people with lots of skill who can make plays. And it really looked like the makings of a future, perhaps number one line. Honestly, like he outplayed Nick Suzuki in training camp a year ago quite handily, like really by a lot. So, what's happened since is it's really unfortunate for a guy who has legit a ton of talent and really has all the tools to be a very, very effective star level player in the NHL. But, he's played 59 games since that training camp, and he's had 2 surgeries on his right knee now, and his outlook is completely different. And I don't know if we're ever going to see that player, that exact version of that player ever again, but it doesn't mean that he's a total write-off to be an NHL player.
Well, I think that he'll need to stay healthy at some point and get into a cadence where, he can play a full season. This year was his 6th season in the NHL. He's never played more than 70 games. That was in Chicago, his 3rd year in Chicago. But in Montreal, he played 58 games, 2 games, and this year 57. So those are not complete seasons, and he'll need one in order to ascertain what sort of player he is exactly, how good he can be, and get his confidence rolling. So I'm sure that, his talent has not disappeared. His toolkit, we'll see in terms of, his skating, how it is when he comes back, but there's elements to his game that he won't have lost in the meantime. But so to me, it's not completely a write-off, but in order for him to rekindle with that potential, he'll need to be on the ice and play a full season. And it's unfortunate because he has not done so at all. So, and also there's, you mentioned, the Canadians could move on from him if they consider that, he's not worth the money after next season. What's interesting is that, so he'll need to get a qualifying offer because he's going to be an RFA with arbitration rights. And his qualifying offer, well, the qualifying offer is based on the player's base salary from the previous season. So in this case, that would be the last season of his contract. And next year, his base salary is going to be $4 million. Yeah. So at the end of next year, the Canadians would have to wonder, is he worth a qualifying offer of $4 million? So it's not even just the average of $3.36 million. That's his actual cap hit or AAV. It's $4 million. So I know it's a write-in cap, blah, 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 but still.
Well, yeah, it's $4 million in a $104 million cap.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's...
Yeah. So, but, this year his base salary is $2.85. It would have been, I don't know. I just find that everybody says, constantly say, oh, well, that's okay. Cap is going up, but just be aware how you spend.
But the thing is that if you're questioning whether he's worth a $4 million qualifying offer, then that means you've determined that he's just not a fit on your team, right? Like if he hasn't played himself into a $4 million qualifying offer by the end of next season, I think that die will have been cast in the sense that the Canadians will have already made the determination that he's not going to be part of the solution moving forward from that point. I mean, that's...
But what if they had to make that decision now? Do you think he'd be worth a $4 million qualifying offer? based on what we saw this year?
I mean, a one year deal at $4 million. I think the Canadiens would roll that dice and see. The Canadiens have always been tantalized, and this has always been the difference with Dach than it is with, say, Joshua Watt. The Canadiens have a lot of belief in Watt's potential, but they've never actually seen it at the NHL level, and
Mm-hmm.
and so it's an unknown. It's abstract. Um, in Doc's case, and even in Newhook's case, it's somewhat abstract. He's never really had a stretch where he's kind of defined himself as being sort of a high end player. In Doc's case, it's not abstract. They've seen it. And and that's what's so tantalizing is that they saw it, and it wasn't just like a tiny sample. It was like a quarter of a season, which isn't a huge sample, but still, what they saw in that quarter of a season at age 22 looked really, really good. And what they saw in that training camp at age 23, or well, he was still 22 at the time, looked really, really good. And so they have actual visual evidence that they've seen in the recent past that suggests that this can be a player who can be a difference maker of sorts, not a superstar or anything, but a really highly effective, rare player at his size and reach and hands and just how effective he was at recovering pucks and getting pucks back and just sneaky stick lifts and like just stealing pucks. He was a poor man's Mark Stone in that sense. Like he really had that ability that Stone has. Like Stone's elite at it. Dach wasn't necessarily elite at it, but he was very good at it. It was just something that it was a strength of his. Didn't really see that much this season. A lot to go with the lack of mean streak and the lack of physicality. So like the version of Dach they saw this year over 57 games. So a big sample, but I would say like maybe 30 of those games or 25 of those games where the Canadiens are like, and I'm just assuming here, but the Canadiens are probably like, okay, you had a slow start, 25 games, 30 games. Now let's see what you're all about. And really from December 28th, when the Canadiens sort of turned their season around, a lot of that was driven by Dach producing goals. He started scoring. He scored, I think, twice on December 28th. I'm just pulling up his game log, but that's just from memory. Yeah, he scored 2 goals in Florida on December 28th. The trip that I think, devoted 2 episodes to that was going to ruin the Canadian season, right? And so he scored 2 goals in that game, scored a goal in the game in Vegas that the Canadiens won, obviously. A goal against Vancouver when they came back home, a couple of goals in Utah, another goal in that Toronto game where they gave up the touchdown over the end of the game. Anyhow, 7 unanswered goals. And so if you take that part out, like that's a stretch of 10 odd games, 10, 11 games. That's 4, 6, that's 7 goals in those 11 games and an assist. Otherwise, his season's not a whole lot there. It's a goal and assist against Detroit, in Detroit, 2 assists in San Jose, 1 assist in LA. That's about it. And so
we thought at some point that he had turned the corner.
But I think even Marty said it at one point. We said, I think he's on the other side of it now. But even that stretch where he was scoring regularly, like underlines honestly didn't look all that good in that stretch. And so, but I do think that the Canadiens need to allow for the possibility that they continued trying to put a square peg in a round hole based on what they saw 2 years ago and continued trying to have him be a play driving centerman like he looked like he was 2 years ago, instead of being a complementary winger, which I think if they do that, maybe they get a valuable player out of Kirby Dach still. But he's not, or this season at least was not, and frankly, after another surgery, probably will not be a play driving centerman. Like I just can't see that as being part of his future. So, and again, I think the Canadiens were patient enough with him give him time to figure things out, and it just never happened. And so that was already part of their evaluation, and now they have a clear item on their to-do list this offseason, which is to somehow find a centerman. And
Mm.
if you ask Mark Bergevin, they don't grow on trees, right? So that it's pretty hard to they're pretty hard to trade for, according to him. He told us for years. And we thought the Canadians had done that in the Dach deal, which was a very creative deal. And it's real smart. And you mentioned Frank Nazar. I think the guy that maybe they would have taken with that 13th pick would have been Rutger McGroarty, who went 14th.
Yeah.
But either way, I would have rolled the dice on Dach over McGroarty or Nazar at the time, and even now, frankly. I mean, yes, Nazar's doing pretty well in Chicago. McGroarty is still not in the NHL, so it's
But I would not have traded Romanov for that pick.
for the 13th pick. I mean, the left
I
side
don't
of
know.
the left side of their defense is not an issue. Yes, Romanov's great. I mean, I don't think they could have anticipated how injury prone Caden Gooley would be, and it's been like just a sequence of unfortunate. Him slicing his own leg open is not something that you can
No,
really
I know. No,
chalk up to being
no.
injury prone. But I think they did rightly see that they had probably a better version of Romanov in Gooley, and that he became somewhat not expendable, but they got great value for him. I mean, it's not as if they
Sure.
traded him
But
for nothing.
there was an aspect of maybe redundancy with the number of guys on the left side for sure.
And there still is.
And
Like, listen, right now we're looking at Jaden Struble and Arbor Jacki. Like, both of them are probably not going to play for this team because, I mean, as long as Matheson's here and Gooley's here, that left side is kind of set. So, and I love
yeah,
Romanov. I still love Romanov. He's doing great in New York, and he's playing well, and he's a good defenseman. But you have to give to get, and I thought that was an area of strength, one of the few areas of strength the Canadians had at the time, and even still do, to try and address an area of weakness, and it was worth a shot, and it still might be worth that shot. Dach can still turn into a decent player. It's not over. The story is not finished, So it's like
no, for sure. It's just it's like in all likelihood in a different role. Alex Newhook said this morning. He said he was playing well. It's a big hole to fill. I think his game was getting to a pretty high level. I think our line was even starting to find each other a bit more and starting to find more consistency. We're going to miss him, and it's another big role for someone to fill. We need guys to step up, myself included. A lot of the guys on the lineup need to step up and fill that role and bring that offense that we're going to miss. So,
Alex, we're gonna have to agree to disagree, Alex, on your assessment of how things were going before Kirby Dach got hurt.
yeah,
But that's fine. I mean, what else is he gonna say? But he is a guy who can step up. Like, he is a guy who can. It'd be
he's number
nice.
one in terms of
He's
stepping up and next man up. That's Alex
yeah,
Newhook. That's yeah, and it's not
yeah.
even clear if he's going to be the one playing center. For the time being, Owen Beck, the rookie, has been presented the idea that even if he's going to play center, the first time he was called up this year and he played wing, he had never played wing before. So that was the
Mhm.
adjustment, even more so than playing in the NHL. But Marty presented that to him and said, listen, you're going to take faceoffs. But once the puck is on the ice, it's going to be pretty much positionless hockey. And so it's going to be, if you are the last the first man back, well, you're going to be the center. You're going to do the center job, and you might be back in front behind before a D, and you're going to play D just when the situation needs it, obviously. So and he's learning that, and for him, it's not going to be such a big deal. But going from Dach to Owen Beck, I mean, I really like Owen Beck. He's going to be a very good NHL player. But in terms of staffing their roster now, there are issues. And, before we get to even trying to figure out how they could replace Dach on the trade market this summer, there's another trade market. It's the one for next week. with the trade deadline. And you got to wonder if, with Dach going down and the center line becoming awfully thin, yes, the Canadians can say we're going to move Newhook to center. They could have Suzuki, Newhook. They could keep Dvorak and then having Beck there if they still choose to move Evans and Armia. But all in all, they would go down to 11 forwards if you include Pizzetta. So and that's Josh Anderson. God knows how long he's going to be able to continue his season. So probably
he's on a plane to Buffalo. He's arrived in Buffalo as we record this on late Friday afternoon. So
yeah. So so my question to you would be: do you think that this news on Dach potentially changes the plans on their intention or the perspective? Let's put it this way: of trading Jake Evans?
No, I don't at all. They're only trading Jake Evans if they get the price that they want for him. And if they get that price, I have no doubt that they will trade him. Like, that's it. But if they don't get that price, I have no doubt they will keep him. And that's the thing, is they don't. And now they're only further incentivized to keep him. So, like, I think the assumption is, well, I can say quite assuredly that a second round pick is what they'd like for Evans alone, and a first round pick is what they'd like for Evans and Armia together. And they have a history of doing this. Last year, they set a first round pick as the price for David Savard. They didn't get it. They kept him. So this year, that's basically the price that they've set on those two transactions. What they would actually do, I don't know what. I don't get a sense of what the price would be for Armia alone as a trade asset, but for Evans, I think a second round pick would get it done, and for both, I think a first round pick is the bare minimum. And so, I believe that if they get those prices, they will move them, and I don't think they're going to allow, the Dach injury, as opposed to, it only further cements that the Canadians went into the Four Nations break having completed the evaluation of their team. They had an opportunity on January 21st. They were in a wild card spot in the playoffs. Everything was great, and from then on, they, as Nick Suzuki said it last night, they fell on their faces. And falling on their faces, when they did, basically set the plan for the trade deadline in motion. Like, had they just treaded water over that span, over those final 9 games before the Four Nations, if they just played 500 or a little below 500 even, they would still be firmly in a playoff race right now, and the trade deadline would look quite different. I don't think that they would go out and buy, but maybe under this circumstance with Dach going under, if they were like a point or two out, they have so many draft picks, and it would not shock me if they would be like, okay, well, what can we get for a third round pick? We have like 1 million of them. Let's go see if we can get a stopgap and let these guys continue this push. But as it stands right now, they've won 3 games in a row since they came back from the break. They were 6 points out at the break. They're 5 points out now. Yes, they've like leapfrogged a couple of teams. There's only a couple of teams between them and a playoff spot, but still, they've shaved 1 point off their deficit to a playoff spot. So, the one thing that I think this will do for the trade deadline that maybe changes, and I don't know this for a fact, but if I were Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon, that's that thing that we talked about on Monday in the mailbag about them acquiring help for Laval. That becomes more important now, because they're probably going to have to pluck someone else out of Laval, if not 2 people out of Laval, if they trade Evans and Armia. And so, oddly enough, like Brandon Gignac is a big factor in all of this. Like, it's like his loss in Laval and sort of the nebulous kind of unclear timeline for his return makes a big difference in Laval. Like, there's no doubt about it. Like, it's losing Beck would be
season for him.
It's unfortunate, but he's an important player down there, and he's gone now. along with a bunch of other injuries. And so they need Laval to stay afloat. And because they have to ice, you know, a compliant roster in the NHL or a compliant lineup in the NHL, they will naturally, if they trade Evans and Armia, have to take people off Laval. They can do that strategically and try not to like gut them of their best players, but still, it's it might be a consideration to make a minor league trade or two, or trade a pick to get a minor league player or two from, you know, and the Alex Belzil suggestion you gave on the last episode, I think is a no brainer at this point, right? I mean, like they're going to need someone. So it feels like if this impacts the trade deadline in any way, it would be that it's the added importance to go and get Laval some help so that they can actually go into the playoffs with a decent seeding and not completely reeling on some sort of losing streak or whatever, because they're going to get reinforcements for the playoffs. It's just a matter of getting there in decent shape.
Yeah, yeah. They've got some guys that are that should come back soon. Xavier Simoneau being one of them.
Yeah,
and you know, Meshar is going to be back.
I think it's 6 weeks.
Year. Yeah,
it was 6 weeks.
Up to 6 weeks, so should be back like early April. But the other option would be to make sure that the kids stay in Laval, and you get just a guy to fill up a jersey, like you know, a Colin White version of this season, you know, for Montreal.
Yeah, that's a possibility. It's funny. I was thinking about Colin White the other day and how he just fell off the hockey earth. I was wondering what happened to him. Check that out right now.
No. Colin White. I saw him. No. He was around. When was he? Yeah, he played. Yeah, that's it. I think he was.
He played for the Sharks.
I think he was on their roster when the Canadians were in California.
Yeah, right. He's played 3 games for the Sharks this year. He's got 28 games with the Barracuda, 17 points.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I
maybe they could get
him. No, thanks. That's
fine. He's quiet. Yeah,
that's true. But you know, and the year before it was Chris Tierney. So those guys. You know, who knows? But it would send such a message, though. It's unfortunate because the team is still, in terms of points, they're not far, and you cannot. However, you want to present that to players, they'll still see that 5 points is attainable, no matter the number of teams that are in between them. And you know, you look at teams in the mix. Yes, the Canadians lost Kirby Dach, but the New York Rangers, a team that's in the mix too, that's battling with them. They lost Adam Fox for quite a while. The Detroit Red Wings lost Andrew Kopp. The Boston Bruins lost Hampus Lindholm for the rest of the season, and Charlie McAvoy for a few weeks too. So you know, those are more significant injuries than the Canadians. So I guess the Dach injury is not the tipping point into their decision making, because yes, that slew of losses before the break were probably, you know, the really what killed them, and tipped the scale into selling mode. But if you decide to move on when you're still within striking distance, it's going to be pretty deflating for a team that. And I'll start with Nick Suzuki, the captain, who's been very vocal about this, who's tired of seeing guys go at this time of the year. And
I understand that. But what was the gauge that you use, right? I think it's a good gauge. Yes, they're 5 points out of a playoff spot, but if you go 5 down, they're second to last in the conference, you know. And if you go 5 points down, you know, you're looking at 5 points down would get you to 27th in the league.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a 6th overall pick at that point, you know? Like
the Buffalo Sabres, their next opponents for the next 2 games, are playing good hockey right now. Yeah. So against all odds.
Well, I mean, the Canadians deserve to lose to San Jose. They didn't They didn't come close to deserving to win that game at all. They were terrible. And San Jose controlled that game by any objective measure other than goals. But everything else, they had more chances. They created more turnovers. The Canadians were sloppy. They gave pucks up. Like, they did not play like a team that's trying to prove to their management group that you should invest in us. I'm Kent Hughes, and I watched that team play in a critical game against the worst team in the league, where they can't afford to lose any point. They can't afford to get anything less than 2 points in that game, and they go out and they play a total stinker. Like, they were terrible. They're terrible to the point that they admitted they were terrible and that they were lucky to come out of there with 2 points. And good on them for doing that. You know, every team's going to have games like that. And plus, we should just mention the Sharks were coming off getting to overtime against the Winnipeg Jets, the best team in the league. So it's not as if they're a pushover and they were just going to roll over and die. But I mean, if you're talking about going out and replacing Kirby Dach and worrying about, you know, if Nick Suzuki were to walk into Kent Hughes' office and say, I'm really tired of losing guys, if I were Kent Hughes, I would be like, well, why didn't you show that, you know, back in January? Why didn't you show that in the lead up to the Four Nations? Like, where were you guys? We were right there. We were right there. You guys had played yourself into a genuine playoff team, a literal playoff team on January 21st. And then you win one of your next 9 games.
Yeah, but it would be a bit unfair to put it on Suzuki. That's
Suzuki
true that
put
he
it
had
on himself last night.
Yeah, I know that he had. I know he was upset with the way the last few games before the break. That's fine, but overall, I mean, he's been one of their most consistent player this season. You know, it's not
sure.
It's fine. It's fine that, I mean, I would look at other guys. You know.
Well, I'm just using Suzuki because you mentioned Suzuki saying I'm tired of losing guys.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
You can't be tired of losing guys if your team is in a position to stay in a race and as he put it, they fall on their faces. They fall flat on their faces. Like, he's not really in a position to complain if they sell guys off. And no one on that team is in a position to complain if they sell guys off because they played themselves into that situation. They played themselves and you can't be Kent Hughes and Jeff Gorton and look at this team and say, you know, we're right there. Or we could be next year's Washington if we just get in, you know, kind of thing, which,
yeah.
I mean, Washington does provide that hope. Everyone was laughing that Washington made the playoffs last year with that terrible goal differential. They basically got, you know, run out of the building. Like, in the first round, it was a joke that they were even in the playoffs. And they have one good offseason, and they're the best team in the league. Like, they're going to be a number 1 seed. So why can't we do that? Well,
yeah,
there's a lot of holes on this team, and 2C is the biggest one, but they're one of the worst defensive teams in the league still. There's a lot of issues that need resolving here. The special teams, the power play stinks. It's like you know, there's a lot that needs fixing. And while a playoff appearance would be valuable, you know, it was interesting hearing Nick Suzuki, you know, talk about the Four Nations. You know, and I was kind of like thinking, like, yeah, he must have been wondering, like, you know, I could have been there, you know, I should be on that team and whatever. And yes, he thought that, but what he thought even more was, you know, watching the Canada USA game on television at the Bell Center. What came into his mind is that he has never experienced that environment at the Bell Center. He has never been in a playoff game with fans in the building at the Bell Center, and that's what came to his mind. When he watched that game, he's like, that can be us in that building with those fans behind us. And so, you know,
I want that.
Yeah, I want that, really. And, you know, and good on him. He's got 8 points in 3 games coming out of the break. He's owned it. He was very honest last night after the game against San Jose that I wasn't happy with the way our line played. I wasn't happy with what happened to the team in general going into the break. He thought about it over the break, you know, much like Slavkovsky. You know, it wasn't he does want that. And so that does have value. I'm not discounting that, but the team the team has not shown, and I think it was further cemented against San Jose. They've not shown that they're likely to get to that the way they're currently constituted, and it's not going to be a sort of marginal rental ad at the deadline that's going to get them there.
No. So, are we getting into who could be a good second line centerman for this team next year? Are we delving into that today?
Listen, I mean, the obvious target would be Sam Bennett, but otherwise, I really don't think it's something that we can even handicap right now, because this is most likely going to be addressed by a trade, and in that sense, I think it's just a wide open debate. Right? It's like what I think the Canadians, like we've often talked about the Dach Newhook trade. You know, there was always that all last year. It's like, what's going to be this year's Dach Newhook trade?
Yeah,
they need to not do a Dach Newhook trade. They need to go get a player that's good and pay for that player. Pay what needs to be paid for that player. And if that means trading, you know, probably one of their better prospects plus some picks, whatever. Like, you see David Reinbacher and Logan Mailloux, right shot D being as valuable as they are, could one of them be used to go get a player? And I don't think the Canadians would want to trade either of them. But again, you have to give to get, and there's lots. I mean, aside from Demidov, I don't really think any of them are untouchable. Just depends on what the player would be coming back. But I think other than Demidov, they'd be open to talk about anyone if a certain caliber of player is coming back. And the other thing that I think the Canadians are more than willing to do is if they need to throw in an extra second round pick or an extra third round pick to get a trade over the finish line, they've already shown that they're willing to do that. They did it in the Newhook deal. They did it in the Dach deal where they threw in a pick to get that over the finish line. They've done it a number of times where they just use all that extra draft currency to do a slight overpay in that sense. And I don't think they would hesitate to do that. And that's really the big value of that war chest is they can outbid teams based on throwing in an extra pick if that's what makes the difference. So they're pretty well positioned to try and strike. They just got to identify the right guy, and not necessarily a guy who's been undervalued or has been underperforming on the team that they're on right now, like Dach and Newhook were. But
no, it's quite the opposite. They should go after guys who have proved their worth and that they can count on. Yeah, guys that are potentially older and that are going to bring their experience and an element of stability to a young core.
Agreed. And they need to pay for that. And so really, I mean, the teams that you're looking at are teams like the Islanders. I mean, the Penguins don't really have anyone that comes, unless they want to trade Malkin, but even I think he's a little too old. But, teams that are teetering, like the Bruins, the Blues, like I'm not talking about actual trade possibilities. The Rangers, like teams that have spent a lot of their draft capital over the years to try and remain in contention and are kind of coming out the other side of that now. Those would be the kinds of teams that the Canadians could probably do business with. Colorado, there's a bunch. Tampa would be a big one. Toronto, like teams, and again, these are I'm listing teams that have used a lot of that don't have a lot of pipeline that could use a replenishing of their pipeline. Those are the teams that the Canadians could probably go see and say, listen, if you want to quickly replenish your pipeline, like you have no better customer than us. Because really, I think Montreal and Utah are probably very going to be competing in this market, in this trade market, because they have a similar collection of assets, right? And they're similarly trying to come out of a rebuild and get over that hump into contention. So that's, to me, is going to be the biggest competition for the Canadians this offseason is going to be a team like Utah, who's probably also going to look to bring in experience and bring in some more established players and try and get them into the playoffs as of next year. And so, but there's not many teams in that category. Those are probably really the only two that I can think of. Maybe Anaheim's the other one.
One, I've been thinking about this for a bit now, even before Kirby Dach's injury. But as guys who could potentially be added through trades, and you mentioned the New York Islanders, and to me, Bo Horvat is a very interesting candidate.
Yeah.
Left shot, so which is for a centerman who's so good at in the face-off circle.
Yeah.
He's a very good bumper on the power play. He plays a 200-foot game. Yeah, sure, he makes $8.5 million a year for 6 years after this one. He's 29. Yeah. So at the end of his contract, he won't be worth it. Sure, but I think that he would be a very surgical add to this team, depending on how Lou wants to, guide his ship, obviously, in Long Island, because
also depending on if Lou is still doing that job.
That is a good point. That's a good point. But I mean, if because if they choose to go in a rebuild, then he becomes an interesting candidate. But to me, it's you cannot. The Canadians are young enough that it's all right to bring another, guys that are in their mid-20s and whatnot. But I feel as though having a late 20s, borderline 30s veteran who would bring some stability for a number of years, it would be very an attractive option to me. So
it's also worth noting that by the last season of Bo Horvat's contract, the salary cap could be $120 million.
Yeah, that's it. So you can bring out that argument that in the terms of a percentage of the cap, it would be diluted and it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't worry anymore. It wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
So
it's not
we'll see. I mean, I know. I've been naming.
I thought you were going to say Barzal because you've been talking about that. You've been talking about Barzal too as a possibility because the Islanders are in such a there's such a no man's land. Yeah. That at some point you got to think like ownership would be like, let's pick a lane here,
Yeah, that's true. But as you learn how, a front office wants to go and what they value and what the rest of the team looks like and what it needs, I think that the Canadians would need more a Bo Horvat than a Matthew Barzal.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. That's and just in case people are wondering, this season, Bo Horvat, 57 games, 19 goals, 41 points, 20 minutes a night, 60.1% in the faceoff circle. And he has, only 5 points on the power play, which is kind of surprising. 3 power play goals, but still, it's their power play is atrocious.
Yes, so it is.
Yeah, he's not. It's not as if he's still Bo Horvat at age 29. I think he's 29.
Yeah, he's 29.
Something like that. Yeah, so he's still Bo Horvat. Those are like kind of typical Bo Horvat numbers. And so, I don't hate that. It's not a bad hypothesis, but it does like it's actually in terms of an example of what the Canadians can do this offseason. I mean, that's a good example because if you look at the Islanders. Let's see what they have all their picks in this draft. They don't have a second or a fifth in next year's draft. Their prospect pool is barren, is just barren. They got nothing coming. And so they need to at least do some sort of reset or refresh or something to ensure that they can compete down the road because they're not getting better organically, right? They're a mature team, and most of their key guys or a lot of their key guys are in their 30s. Horvat's on the verge of it. It's something could shake free there. Obviously, we had the rumors of Noah Dobson being available. Who knows if that's true? But if that is true, I know he's not a center, but I would be making calls about Noah Dobson. That's for sure. So
Yeah, but the same assets that you would probably spend to go after Dobson, you would not have them to go after your second line center.
that's true. That's true. But and this is actually sort of an interesting example of where the Canadians find themselves is they're in a mode where they need to make targeted moves. I think 2 years ago, if it was like, okay, well, Noah Dobson's available and Bo Horvat's available, no brainer, you go for Noah Dobson just because he's the better player, and you just bring him in and then figure it out after. Whereas I think now you could still make that argument that the Canadians should do that, but I do think that their mindset is let's go address holes in our lineup. Let's go address holes. And I think a number one right shot D is a hole that the Canadians need to address, and Dobson would fill it. But that's their mindset when they're looking at the trade market. It's very specific. They're not just randomly acquiring assets anymore. It's very going to be more targeted. And so, and not to say that it's necessarily going to be with the Islanders, but I think that's a very good example of the type of team that the Canadians should be dealing with. A team that needs to gear up for the future and doesn't have a whole lot coming in their own pipeline.
Yeah. All right. Time for Future Friday, my friend.
Future Friday it is. Future Friday.
Okay, so today for Future Friday, we're going to talk about Sean Farrell in a minute. But there's one thing that we wanted to bring to your attention, and it was something that was written by our colleague Guillaume Lepage at the French version of NHL.com, lnh.com.
My former home.
That's it? Yeah. You're a former boss there.
I hired Guillaume Lepage.
There you go.
Yeah.
You have a knack.
He does good work. He does good work over there.
He does, yeah. And because he spoke with goalie Quentin Miller, formerly of the Quebec Remparts and formerly of the Rimouski Oceanic, who chose to leave the Q and go play in the BCHL, where he joined the Chilliwack Chiefs. Mm-hmm. So he was injured for the better part of the season so far and played only a handful of games in the BCHL. But the interesting thing is that he committed to the University of Denver for next season. So, as you might know, people, there's now new rules that allow CHL players to make the jump to the NCAA and potentially vice versa, but it would be more logical to do CHL to NCAA. So, even though, by making that move, Quentin Miller is giving himself and the Canadians 4 more years of runway before he can turn pro. So he was a draft pick in 2023, which means that had he stayed in the queue, forget the BCHL, but had he stayed in the queue, the Canadians would have had to decide this summer, do we give this kid a contract so that he turns pro, and maybe, or we ask him to play his 20-year-old season in the queue, extended for, just wait for 1 more year or whatever, or maybe just sign him to an American deal. They have different ways of going about it. Mm-hmm. But basically, it would have been crunch time. But now they reset the clock so that he's got 4 years additional because he's going to college. And so it's very interesting for a goalie who's, as we know, they're very late in their development. But now you got a goalie who's 20 years old, who's got, interesting potential, who's going to a program that's highly regarded in the NCAA. And the Canadians could wait 3 or 4 years before they can determine, okay, this guy, now we know enough about him and we know that he's an interesting prospect for us. We're going to sign him. So I think it's an interesting development for both the player and the team.
It's actually very similar to what happened with Vincenz Rohrer, in the sense that him by going to Europe.
Yes.
He extended his clock, didn't get limited by that CHL clock, which frankly I think needs to be addressed in the next CBA. It's a huge disadvantage for the CHL, especially in this environment where players can go back and forth between the NCAA and the CHL. That CHL clock, signing clock, needs to be adjusted because it's not conducive to. It doesn't help anyone, frankly. So, but yeah, it is. That's a good development, especially for a goalie like that. Going to, I mean, you say highly regarded. I mean, Denver's the best program in the country.
Yeah.
You know, quite easily, I would say. But it's so yeah, that is a very interesting development, and so good. And the Volokin kids continues doing well in the KHL. Like there's more than just Jacob Fowler in the pipeline here for the Canadians. So, but I think Quentin Miller is a guy that we don't talk about a whole lot. He's been injured, I think, most of the season.
Yeah.
So, so yeah, it's good of you to good of Guillaume, I guess, to bring him up, and good of us to credit him for his work and talk about it on our podcast. But main topic of conversation is the red hot, smoking, scintillatingly hot Sean Farrell. He has, since in the calendar month of February, he has 15 points. Am I counting that right? 6, 8, 10, 15 points. Just this month.
In 10 games. In 10 games.
It's quite the development, but I mean, I've always wondered how he's going to make that jump, especially on a team that already has Cole Caulfield, that already has Lane Hudson, that has Brendan Gallagher for the foreseeable future. How is an undersized guy like him going to make it? I'm not sure.
Good question. I don't think that he's going to make it with the Montreal Canadiens. I think this is a guy who is showcasing himself the best that he can to everybody in hockey, all 32 organizations, not just the Canadiens.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be ending his entry-level deal at the end of this season. So he's going to be in need of a new contract. Are the Canadiens even going to consider giving him one? Is he going to be a throw-in of some sort? Are they just going to let him walk? It's tricky because, it's one of those situations where a player, yeah, sure, he arrives, he becomes an RFA quicker because then he was kind of fast-tracked to a certain extent. But I think that to a certain extent, it's a disservice, the fact that he arrives at the end of his entry level so quickly into his development, because it doesn't look great for him.
Well, he's probably gonna have to sign an AHL contract, I would think. That to me would be the kind of the natural course of things here. Which it would kind of benefit him if he hadn't burned that first year of his contract at the end of that college season. The infamous "that's a question for Kent" moment. And he had another year left on his ELC. It would probably help him. You're right.
Yeah. So now, I mean, he's been on fire. He's been playing a lot with Lucas Condotta and Alex Barré-Boulet. Mm-hmm. Although today at practice they had switched lines and he was playing with Dauphin and Barré-Boulet, but he's been playing with Condotta for like quite a good chunk of time. And I spoke to him earlier this week, because the turnaround is quite significant, right? The first 22 games of the season, he had only 2 assists. And he says, I thought I'd played some good hockey before Christmas. I was just not capitalizing on my chances. And once I started capitalizing a bit more, with more ice time, I continued to build my confidence and get more touches. But he said that he thought he played some good hockey, but Pascal Vincent said that it's really the fact that he played when he scored his first goal, and that was back on December 14th. The Rocket was playing in Hartford, and he said that just that first goal made all of the difference, because from that point on, he played as a guy that was so relieved to have finally scored, because up to that point he was playing well. His details were good. His attitudes was excellent. His work ethic was excellent. But he got a monkey off his back once he scored that first goal. So first 22 games, only 2 assists. Then after that, 22 points in the next 25 games. But it's really, as you pointed out, February that's been the difference for him. I'm really not sure that it's going to change anything for his place in the hierarchy or within the depth chart in Montreal. But he's salvaging his season. And so that, a guy his size who had a very noticeable NCAA career might be getting a flyer for someone else and say, you know what, he might need more development, more seasoning in the AHL. But hey, we're not an organization that, like Montreal, has a half a dozen undersized guys on their roster. Yeah. So we can take a chance on this kid. So he's positioning himself well into doing that.
Yeah, which, you mentioned earlier, like maybe he'd be a throw-in. Like I think, was Emil Heineman a throw-in? I don't think so. The Canadiens did a lot of research on him. They wanted him. It was yes, they got a first round pick in that Tyler Toffolo trade, but Emil Heineman was an important part of that trade, and now you're seeing how it's paying off for them. So I think a team looking at Sean Farrell, I think the Canadiens should get value for him. Like if they do include him in a trade, and this is kind of why they're so well positioned to make a trade this summer. Is like it's not just the draft picks; it's guys like Sean Farrell. It's guys like Luke Tuck to some extent. Not quite the same, but like it's Florian Xhekaj has been great, and I think the Canadiens actually see a future for him. And yeah, we're going to talk about him.
I see a future Friday for him.
Yeah, exactly. He's going to have a future Friday as well. But like a Jared Davidson, like there's all sorts of guys like that. There are lots of scouts at Laval games. These guys get watched, and like Adam Engstrom's another guy that could just not have room in Montreal, and I think a lot of people view him as a future NHL defenseman. And so these are trade assets, potentially, not necessarily, but when the Canadiens go out and try to address these holes, having guys like Sean Farrell put up 15 points in 10 games when he entered February with 9 points this season, is a tremendous development, and maybe he does catch someone's eye, and maybe he is the guy that can get a trade over the finish line. Like when I mentioned earlier, the Canadiens are not afraid to throw in an extra pick. Well, this is another area of strength where they could get a trade over the finish line with some strong, and that's part of the reason why they want Laval to do so well in the playoffs. If these guys that play for the Rocket get more eyeballs on them, if more people see them play in a playoff environment, guys like Sean Farrell, it only increases their value when they're talking to teams this summer in terms of what they want to do and how they want to address the holes on the Canadiens. So it's a great development.
Yeah, but in this case, they would have to decide on his contract, or else they have to move him. It's true that during the Calder
Cup,
they
could trade him unsigned. As long as it's before July 1st, right? They could trade him unsigned. Yeah.
But I think that he might, if he was to play very well in the Calder Cup playoffs, that would start to carry more weight, because right now, has he done enough to bring a trade to the finish line, like you're saying? I'm not sure about that. But if he was to, open some eyes by being a clutch player, an impactful player in the playoffs, then we're talking. Then he repositions himself. He reignites a value that, honestly, in the last couple of years, seems like it has only been going down.
Yeah. Yeah, it's honestly like he's just had he's like he is part of the he's part of the COVID generation, like a player whose development was pretty severely impacted by COVID, right? It's like it's COVID came at the exact wrong time for Sean Farrell. Like it was like just not ideal. Um, his college experience was not what everyone gets to experience in college. Obviously, it was mainly Zoom, like mainly classes online and not really living in the same dorm that the Harvard hockey team usually lives in. And he was talking about he graduated in like record time because he just did everything
Yeah.
online. So he just did it faster, right? It's like it just did not he did not get the full experience, but which would kind of explain somewhat why it's taken him some more time to get to a place where you can have a month like you just had um, for Laval. And so it's gonna be interesting overall. Like just those kids from that draft year, and like like Wyatt Johnson. The only reason he fell to Dallas was because of COVID. Basically, like I mean, he didn't play that whole season. Dallas took him based on how he played, like on a fourth line at the U18 championships that were in Texas. Um, and so, anyhow, I mean, it's just I find Farrell to be a guy or an example of an age group or a birth year that requires a different lens when viewing them,
Yeah.
just because COVID kind of messed everything up for them.
That's a good point. And just lastly, regarding Farrell, he said that that really him getting going, apart from obviously scoring a goal and getting his confidence back and all that stuff, um, he identified in terms of the foundations of his game, the boxes that he needed to tick were breakouts, making sure that he's sharp in breakouts, and being good on the forecheck. So he says, if I do those two things well, if I'm sharp on breakouts and I'm good on the forecheck, everything else will take care of itself. I'm like that, and I feel as though the whole team has a little bit of that identity too, where it's really where our success starts. So
Mhm.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an organizational identity. I think that they're
Yeah,
trying to establish here. So and a lot of the things that the Canadians prioritize trickles down to the Rocket, and Pascal Vincent is more than willing to be that conduit from Montreal to Laval and these kids. And I was talking to Owen Beck the other day about how Laval prepared him for Montreal, and it's a very and Jakob Dobish talked about this, just how much the work they do in Laval is two pronged. There's work that they're doing to get better in the AHL as a team, and there's work that they're doing to prepare individual players to make the jump to the NHL. And they're very mindful of both tracks, and that there's not they don't get lost in the results in Laval. The main goal remains to prepare players for the Canadians, and I think there's a lot of AHL teams that lose that focus. There's a lot of AHL teams that are owned by individuals or people that are not part of necessarily the organization that they're affiliated with, and so winning takes over on development sometimes. And anyhow, in Laval, because they're owned by the Canadians, first off, but second off, it's there's no blurring of that line. They know what their priority is, and now, um, you know, it's coming the other way, just to sort of go full circle. But now a big priority for the Canadians is to make sure Laval continues to win. So
yeah.
um, they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that they don't sabotage that with their own needs, because in many ways the priority right now is Laval, which is weird, but I think it's the case.
All right, so thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We'll be back on Monday for our subscribers. So tune in. If you are not a subscriber to the BasuandGodin Notebook, you can do so by going to our Substack, which is at BasuandGodin.com. We have different tiers of subscription and membership. You can choose to become a paid subscriber monthly, or for 12 months, all at once. So a yearly subscriber. And you can also become a founding member of our podcast and get to join our monthly Google Meet with our little exclusive little group there that we chat with once a month. We have a lot of fun doing that.
And I just wanted to mention, you just reminded me, but I did see something go by in the chat, and there was a question about the yearly subscription. And I think we've mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, we do plan on having episodes in the off season. They won't be as frequent, obviously, as they are in season, but we will have summer episodes pretty regularly. We haven't come up with an actual calendar yet of how often they'll come out, but we will have summer episodes. So if you're wondering if the summer months will just be wasted because you're not getting any podcasts, you will get some. They won't be as often, but they'll be kind of more targeted. I think kind of project based sort of podcasts where we do sort of deep dives on things and like sort of obviously breaking down what happened in the off season, but just once that's over, we're still going to come out with stuff. So if you're worried about that, if you're thinking about a 12-month subscription, thinking, oh, I'm paying for 2 months that I don't get anything, that's not the case. You will get something. It just won't be as frequent as they are in season. That's all.
And every episode during
will be for
in the summer months will be for paid subscribers. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So we'll be back on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody, and talk to you soon.